Hi there, welcome. My name is Karen Fisher, and it's my privilege to help us walk through the concept of ethics in supervision tonight and to talk through some of our obligations and some of our privileges as we get to work together, leading supervisees in their work as counselors. So tonight what we want to talk through are just a few areas. So some foundations behind ethics and the legal background of why we do what we do and how those two go together. So the relationship between ethical codes and the law. We'll focus in on some particular ethical issues, how we might identify those, how we would work with those. Legal issues as well, some things to be mindful of and educated about, where to find information to help with those concerns. We're talking about as a supervisor, one of the probably most important things that you can do in the realm of ethics and legal issues with supervisees is to work through an ethical decision-making model and thereby prepare them to be ethical decision makers as they encounter these challenges, legal and ethics wise. And then we're going to spend a little time on a case study just to involve ourselves in something more practical, start to apply those skills in a real world setting. So that's the lay of the land for our time together. Foundationally, maybe it would be good to start with why is this important? And what you're looking at here is just a list of some of the ethical breaches or concerns that supervisees commonly report. So there's quite a few of them. Maybe what you'd be interested in most are the ones kind of to the left, and we're going to talk about most of those as we go through. So maybe be thinking about what do you suppose are some of the common breaches that supervisees encounter and what that might feel like. Maybe you had a supervisory experience where you might say, yep, I probably could have said that I encountered an ethical or legal situation, at least that I was unsure of, or that I was very uncomfortable with or didn't quite understand how it was handled. So one of the ways we obviously work on that is through our rapport and through other models that we build with our supervisees. But sometimes things do occur and we want to be able to address those in advance if we can, so that no one has to be subjected to that. Really, the ethics and the legal codes, of course, are there to protect the clients and patients. And so being able to find ways to uphold them doesn't just benefit us, of course. It primarily is benefiting the safety and health of the client. And so even as the supervisor, right, that is your responsibility as a supervisor of an in-training individual. Another thing that we'll talk about tonight is a little bit more around how do we manage some of the expectations and help our supervisees understand their roles and responsibilities. Interestingly, less than 19% of supervisors provide an informed consent. Interesting, right? Because we would do that, of course, with clients. We would always offer an informed consent so that they know what is occurring and what their responsibilities are, what our responsibilities are. That would be spelled out. But less than 20% of supervisors do that. So certainly we're going to talk about that a little bit more tonight. And only 41% really used a supervision contract, meaning an extra document that says, this is what we agreed to in terms of what I will offer you as a supervisor and what you will be responsible for in our relationship. A lot of pieces that could go into those informed consents and contracts that would spell out, you know, the ethical and legal views, ramifications, processes, and procedures that might avoid any ethical breaches or legal concerns. So definitely want to keep those things in mind, and that's why talking about ethics and legalities is important in supervision. When you think about ethical codes and the law, there's certainly some relationship between them. We could talk about it in the sense that the law kind of guides or qualifies what would go into an ethical code. So anything that would be in an ethical code would, of course, need to be legal. So in that way, the qualification or the set of standards that an ethical code has as it's implemented needs to also be within the law, right? So the two interact in that way. You might also flip that from the other side and notice that there might be legal sanctions that would be put in place following misconduct, right? So if an ethical code or consideration is abused and there's misconduct, there are many times where legal sanctions are potentially at play. So because of the ethics code upholding these things, you are now in violation of something that could or may or may not be a legal issue. Another way to think about the relationship between ethics and laws is to think about how stable they are and how they're influenced. So ethics are stable, right? They come from some sort of body, accreditation body, or let's say some organization, the ACA, for example. So they are abided by that entire body and adopted by anybody who is a member of that body. So they don't change. They've been vetted, they've been approved, they've been co-signed, and they are, in fact, what any member of that body agrees to do. So they're stable, they don't fluctuate, and they're stable across anyone who's a member, regardless of where that member might be, okay? That is not true, right, of laws. Laws will fluctuate and change based on a lot of things. Probably the most obvious of which would be states, right? States will have different laws from area to area dictating what is considered within the limits of their particular state code. So ethics maybe see them as more reliable, more stable, more even. Laws will change based on various, let's say, professions or states or maybe other parameters. Within, let's say, the conversation around the relationship between ethics and legal issues, there are a couple things that typically come up. Things like confidentiality, right? Are there differences in what your ethical code would say about how you keep confidentiality? And then what the law might say. So is it possible that the two might not line up exactly the same? So would there be professions in which confidentiality would be breached more quickly than in other professions? Or would there be places where the law might compel you to be at odds with an ethical code? That could happen, right? So a lot of times we'll watch for legal challenges to things and then adjust. So many of us are going to be, for example, familiar with the Tarasoff count and the duty to warn in certain situations. That has not always been, right, the law. So those things can change in terms of even confidentiality. Liability. Who's liable for what? Liable just means responsible, right? And so between ethics and laws, there are sometimes differences. There are also sometimes commonalities. Would it be true that a supervisor is liable for the conduct of a supervisee? Yes, within the ethic, and usually yes, within the law. So sometimes they match, right? And then jurisdictions. Who is actually the one who is enforcing these things? Sometimes we want to go to an ethics board, right, which might be part of an organization, or there would be an ethics board maybe within a state under your state licensure, or there might be a jurisdiction that's a local, designating types of services that can or can't be offered, things like that. Okay, so relationships between the two coexist a lot, and it's good to keep teasing those apart, understanding where they intersect. Within ethics, it's good to know that ethical codes are particular to you too, right? You choose to join organizations or become members of a profession where a particular ethic occurs, and you're typically going to associate yourself, let's say, with a major body that oversees that profession. So for counselors, the American Counseling Association generally is one of those. And so if you are a member of that and by profession uphold that ethic, then you would want to understand, right, what is particular to you about being a member of ACA. So there'd be particular ethical things that are unique only to that code. Same is true of others. If you were a member of other organizations that have a code of ethics, you would be ascribing to say, I uphold those. Those are part of my professional identity and what I do. So I happen to be a member of the American Association of Christian Counselors. There are quite a few things that are similar there, but there are things that are different, right? Because some of the ACA code would not match necessarily the code of ethics that a Christian organization might want to incorporate or hold their members to. So for example, you'll see there are multiple things listed here. Some of them are going to be covered under both codes, some under a single code. But all of them then are codes that I say I practice by. Okay, so then I am held to those. Me particularly, maybe not you. You may not be a member of either or both of those. There are, of course, commonalities, right? So ethical codes tend to have some commonalities, four of them in particular, maybe a couple of others, but these maybe stick out to us that they are contextual, that they talk about what context people are working in, and that they have the same basic context or workflow for a profession, right? So the context of a code would be probably common. There'd be boundaries within the ethical codes. That is definitely one part of, especially in the professional counseling field, boundaries within ethics, very important for us to understand, to practice, to consult, to supervise, to understand that those have detrimental effects when they are not upheld correctly. Commonalities about informed consent. We talked a little bit about this before, but that idea that informed consent involves more than just the end user. That informed consent is a thing that we talk about all of the time within supervision as well. And then that ethical codes will have commonalities about competence. What does it take to be upheld as a professional in this particular genre? What are the competency standards? What are the goals? What are the things people are held accountable to? So codes in general have those commonalities. In particular, the APA, the American Psychological Association, and the American Counseling Association also have a set of things that are common ethical standards. And they're unique probably to the counseling field, although they might overlap again with other professions. So APA and ACA have these commonalities within the code that says we will respect autonomy. So we want to, even as supervisors, right, we will respect the fact that the individual we are supervising is an autonomous human. We are not here to create robots. We are not here to necessarily just beam down information. They are individuals. They come with their individual sets of challenges and so and gifts and talents too. And so we are the stewards of that, to respect that and to grow that for them and with them. Beneficence, that as I'm doing things to benefit other people. I'm not doing them out of some sort of selfish gain. I am looking to be of service in a helping profession, and that is supervisorily something we want to instill in our supervisees. Non-malfeasance, that I am in fact not working to do harm or to hurt or to do something poorly. I am here to do a good job, right, and to care for people. So supervisorily, how do I ensure that my supervisee understands what is harmful and that they are held to a code that says I won't harm people? That justice, right, is social justice, advocacy, that those are parts of how we work as a profession. It's part of our identity, and as supervisors, we want to model how do we purvey justice for those in our care who need advocacy and help. Fidelity means I'm faithful in my work. So supervisorily, you model that a lot. You show up for your appointments. You make sure that notes are done. You check on everything that your supervisee needs. You respond timely. All of those things show that faithfulness or fidelity ethic. Integrity, that I say what I mean and I mean what I say and I do what I say, that I follow through, that I can be trusted, is literally part of the ethical code. Certainly you want to do that in front of a supervisee. It's modeling to see that for them, that someone is in fact doing what they say. And then under AP, it's also true that we want to have an ethic of self-care, that as we work in a helping profession, that we model how we remain healthy. And a way to do that, of course, as a supervisor, might be to build in conversations around how are we caring for ourselves, as well as the people around us. Other things that come up under ethics, due process, and in fact, with supervisees, this is where informed consent and the supervision contract become part of your ethic and your obligation as a supervisor. You want to be very clear on things like boundaries and multiple relationships within the supervisory dyad. Really talking through that and getting that on paper with that supervisee so that they understand what they are not to engage in terms of relationships, what your boundaries will be, and what will never be crossed. We want that for their safety and understanding as well, right? So definitely part of informed consent in the supervision contract to address those things, talk about those things, wrestle with those things, and help them understand. Competence. What is it that we're going to measure? What is it that we're looking for? So in supervision, probably want to be looking and saying, these are the competencies that we know are valuable. You know, you're going to use maybe some tool like maybe the CCSR or something along those lines to measure some things so that those competencies can be examined, right? So that the supervisee knows, hey, I started here and I've improved here, and here are still the things that we need to work on. So it gives you those talking points and those data sets to say, hey, we've done well here, but now let's focus here, okay? Within that due process and informed consent and supervision contract, you also want to, explain yourself as the evaluator throughout the process. We don't want people getting to the end of this process and then a supervisor says, no, you're not ready for me to sign off on your professional licensure application. As you evaluate, as you go, you set up those gates, you make sure you check and you have conversation along the way to say, we need to be better about this particular thing. And that ties right back to the informed consent and the supervision contract. These are the things that I'm going to be evaluating, looking for, and basing my decisions on. And then confidentiality. What becomes probably the hardest ethic, I guess personally I would say, is to uphold confidentiality in the sense that that the supervisee really understands what you are holding to yourself, right? There's a power differential here that says, if I tell my supervisor certain things, what will happen? And so, again, I look at the informed consent, the supervision contract, as a way for individuals to understand why it's necessary for them to share vulnerabilities in the course of their professional instruction with you. And then what are the boundaries and limits of that? What will you do if you're finding that the things that they're sharing need to be handled elsewhere, right? So would I refer you to counseling and how would I do that? And to have that all spelled out within the contract and to talk about that openly, right, provides that safe environment we want so that ethically we can keep what we need to keep to ourselves and we have an idea of what might not stay there. A couple of the major legal issues to talk about: malpractice and liability. So malpractice, avoiding harm to another person, right? It can be done through negligence or purposeful, right? And so we want to definitely follow all the standards of practice. That's why understanding the ethical codes is good, is important, and we want to ensure that there's no harm to clients, right? The professional is liable for harm cost, okay? So when it comes to malpractice, you as the supervisor are the one responsible. There are three kinds of liability that might fall into discussion here, and a lot of supervisors get nervous about this. Again, if you're faithful in your work, you'll be as on top of this as you can. So direct liability, I actually, as the supervisor, harm someone. So it could be that I'm harming a supervisee or a client in some way, shape, or form. Vicarious liability, that supervisee is doing harm and I knew or should have known that, right? It's happening in a space where if I was supervising well, I would know that. So that's vicarious. And then there's just strict liability, which says if the supervisee harms someone, I might still be liable, especially if I'm unaware, I might still be liable. So those are the ones most people are concerned about, that strict liability if my supervisee is harming someone and I'm unaware. But again, if you're in that relationship and you're looking for that rapport, you're going to be able to talk through a lot of the things that would rise to the level of being concerned and care of the client. Couple other things. How would you manage all this risk? So be open, right? Have that trusting relationship. Be up to date on these legal issues. When those bulletins come from ACA, be reading those. See what's new. Ensure that there's support, right? So if you have those questions, who are you going to call? Do you have a state agency that you contact, or do you call the ACA, or do you look on their website for Q&A to just get some support if you're concerned about something? Make sure that insurance is in place for you and your supervisee. And then, lean in on that informed consent and that contract and put those pieces of information there. How do you navigate all that? Well, I think you want to keep in mind a little bit of this quote, which just says, a lot of times we want to lean into our intuition. Our brain will kind of operate that way. But we might need to slow down and really ask our rational brain to kick in. And really, that's what ethics and legal codes are trying to get us to do. We don't just do things because it seems like the right thing. We follow through and do it because it's through a decision-making model of ethics. So in order to do that, we might have a ethical decision-making model to follow. Make those values explicit, right? Like we talked about. Make sure that we have ethical codes understood. The DCBA acronym kind of helps us understand how we might apply some of these ethics to an instance, right? I would look at the danger, the duty, and the documentation. What do I understand about what was going on within the situation, right? I'm looking at all of those C's: consent, confidentiality, competence, consultation. Have I been looking and understanding and applying those ethical limits to the case that I'm considering? Are there boundary issues that I want to look through or think about? And then how do I apply, model, and act and assess about my ethical usage, right? So if you're actively doing those things, and especially if you're modeling that in front of your supervisee, you can talk through ethics as they approach and really think through all four of these layers of the argument to say, where is there something that could have been done better or different? You do that in case consultation often, and then apply those, right? Look for those things and then apply a decision following those considerations. Finally, I'm going to leave you with this case study. Pretty easy case study. Probably it seems a little simple, and then it gets a little dicey. So essentially, Vanessa is the counselor in training, and Gary is her supervisor. And essentially, he has a event, a seminar he wants to go to, and he invites her along. And then things get what it seems like just kind of typical, but questions start to arise as to why some of these invitations were made, what either of them should have done, how that played out in the back after the event, and kind of the repercussions of that. So take a look at the case study of Vanessa and Gary. There's 4 questions there for you to kind of wrestle with individually and with others as you discuss it. All right, so hopefully that was a good review for you of ethics and legal issues in supervision.